Chapter 1. The Silent Village and the Arrogant Outsider. The fog over Loch Dhu was not merely weather. It was a physical barrier, a thick, damp curtain of grey wool that smelled of wet slate and unlit fireplaces. For Hamish Macbeth, police constable of this remote Highland outpost, such days were synonymous with bliss. It meant the tourists, those colourful, loud, and chronically lost creatures, remained sequestered in their boarding houses, and the road to Strathbane was treacherous enough to discourage even the most overzealous of his superiors. Hamish sat in his small, draughty station, his feet propped up on a rickety desk that groaned under the weight of his boots. He held a mug of coffee that had long since surrendered its warmth, staring blankly at the frost creeping across the windowpane. Beside him, Lugs, his lanky, deceptively scruffy dog, was snoring with a rhythmic, wet intensity that Hamish found immensely soothing. "Not a soul stirring, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his voice a low, raspy drawl. "Just how the world should be." He was currently debating the merits of attempting to poach a salmon from the lower reaches of the loch versus staying exactly where he was and napping until the spring thaw. It was a rigorous intellectual exercise, one he took quite seriously. He had spent years carefully curating his reputation as a man whose greatest professional achievement was his ability to fill out a report form without accidentally spilling his tea on it. It was a brilliant, necessary mask. If the world thought you were an idiot, they left you alone. And in Loch Dhu, being left alone was the highest form of luxury. The sound of an engine, high-pitched, aggressive, and entirely out of place, ripped through the silence like a jagged blade. Hamish didn't move, though his ears pricked up. It was a vehicle of significant expense, and very little sense, given the state of the village roads. A moment later, the police station's front door was opened. A man stood framed in the threshold, shaking a wet umbrella like a weapon. He was dressed in a three-piece tweed suit that looked like it had been tailored for a magazine spread. His face was a map of metropolitan irritation. "Good God, is this the police station? It looks more like a shed for discarded gardening tools," the man declared, his voice cutting through the damp air. Hamish slowly lowered his feet from the desk, giving the man a vacant, heavy-lidded stare. "Morning," he said, his Highland accent thick and lethargic. "You're in the right place, though the kettle's just gone off. I'm Hamish. What can I be doing for you on a day fit for neither man nor beast?" The man entered, sniffing the air with disdain. "I am Nigel Thorne. I've come up from the city. My sister was to arrive in Loch Dhu 3 days ago for her wedding. She's vanished into thin air, and all I get from the local innkeeper is talk about the spirits of the hills. I need someone to actually look for her." Hamish sighed. A missing person, a city person, a wedding. It was a trifecta of misery that promised to involve long, cold walks, tedious conversations with worried relatives, and an inevitable shouting-filled encounter with DCI Blair from Strathbane. "Missing, you say?" Hamish stood up, his tall, lean frame unfolding with the languid motion of a cat. He gave the man a look of profound, rural confusion. "People don't usually go missing here, sir. They just wander off for a bit of air. Maybe she's just taken a fancy to the scenery. She's a bride-to-be, you fool. She doesn't wander off. She's staying at that wretched local inn, and the manager there says she left on foot with a small suitcase. I want a search party. I want this village turned upside down until she's found." Hamish scratched the back of his neck, his hazel eyes flickering with a sharp, hidden intelligence that Nigel Thorne completely missed. He looked like a man trying to solve a very difficult multiplication problem using only his fingers. "Search party," Hamish repeated, as if tasting the words and finding them sour. "Right. Well, I'll have a word with the postmistress. If anyone's left the village, she'll know." Thorne scowled, his face reddening. "I expect more than a word with a postmistress. I expect professional action." "Aye," Hamish said, his tone perfectly flat. "I'll get right on it, once I've had my breakfast. It's a bit of a hike, you see, and I've a delicate constitution." Thorne stared at him, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. He looked around the dusty, draughty station, then back at the red-headed policeman who seemed to be pondering the location of his own toes. With a grunt of pure, unadulterated contempt, Thorne turned and marched back out into the rain, slamming the door so hard a stack of old files rattled off the shelf. Hamish waited until the sports car roared away, before he finally allowed his expression to drop. The sluggishness evaporated, his eyes narrowing as he approached the window. "A bride," he murmured to Lugs, "a small suitcase, and a brother who's more interested in shouting than searching." He reached for his coat. His peaceful morning was well and truly dead, and he had a feeling that the missing woman was not nearly as lost as her brother insisted. He merely hoped that whatever secret she was hiding was worth the inevitable migraine DCI Blair was about to inflict upon him. Chapter 2. Death Among the Standing Stones. The following morning brought a biting, crystal-clear frost that turned the heather into spun glass and made the air sharp enough to slice a man's lungs. The fog had vanished, leaving Lockdow bathed in a pale, indifferent sunlight. Inside the police station, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his most solemn duty, avoiding the telephone. He sat by the wood stove, watching the leftover stew bubble. Lugs were asleep. Hamish had just decided to pour thick black coffee when the station's front door burst open with a crash. It was Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, a formidable woman built like a Highland fortress. Her face, usually the color of a bruised plum from constant outrage, was entirely chalk white. "Hamish Macbeth, get off your lazy backside this instant," she bellowed, clutching a sensible tweed handbag against her chest like a shield. Hamish blinked slowly, projecting maximum sluggishness. "Morning, Mrs. Wellington. Can I offer you tea? You look as though you've seen a ghost. Or worse, a tourist asking for directions." "This is no time for your feeble jokes. It's that awful English man's sister, the one who was supposed to be getting married. She's been found, Hamish, in the most wretched state." Hamish froze, his hand halfway to the coffee pot. The lazy facade slipped for a fraction of a second, his hazel eyes sharpening into predatory focus, before he blinked and restored his usual bovine expression. "Found? Where, Mrs. Wellington? And why all the hysterics?" "In the old ruins by the standing stones, draped over the altar stone like some sort of grim sacrifice. She's cold, Hamish, stiff as a board." Hamish groaned inwardly. A murder. The paperwork alone would keep him indoors for a week, and worse, it would bring DCI Blair. "Right," he muttered, grabbing his peaked cap and his regulation coat. "Come on, Lugs, work." Lugs whined, thoroughly unimpressed by the concept. The walk to the standing stones was brisk. Frost crunched under Hamish's heavy boots. When he arrived, a small crowd of villagers had already gathered near the ancient, lichen-covered monoliths, whispering in hushed, excited tones. Hamish pushed through them, keeping his shoulders stooped and his mouth slightly open, the very picture of a bewildered country copper. "Stand back, now." "Nothing to see," Hamish said, though there was clearly a great deal to see. The missing bride was indeed there, lying across the flat, mossy surface of the central altar stone. She was dressed in an elegant, cream-colored traveling suit that was now hopelessly stained with damp and dirt. Her hands were folded neatly over her chest, and her face, while pale, held no signs of violence or struggle. It looked as though she had simply lain down to rest and never woken up. Dr. Brodie, the village physician, was already there, looking grim. He was an older man who tolerated Hamish's laziness because he secretly suspected Hamish was the only sensible man in the village. "Morning, Hamish," Dr. Brodie grunted. "Looks like she didn't just wander off for a bit of air." "Is she definitively deceased, Doctor?" Hamish asked, scratching the back of his neck as if confused by the sight. "Cold as a fish. Been here since at least midnight, by the look of the frost on her coat," Brodie replied. "Shall we move her?" "Best wait," Hamish said, his eyes scanning the frosted grass around the altar stone. He appeared to be aimlessly kicking at a clod of dirt, but he was meticulously mapping the footprints. There were heavy, clumpy boot marks, likely from the searchers, but there was a single, smaller, more delicate set of tracks that led away from the altar and into the deep brush. Hamish also noticed a peculiar scent beneath the damp, earthy smell of the ruins. A faint, cloying whiff of jasmine. A perfume that seemed far too expensive for a woman who was supposed to be on a hiking trip. "A strange way to go," Hamish muttered aloud, playing his part. "Must have been out for a stroll, felt faint, and decided to take a nap on a cold rock. A terrible accident," the villagers murmured in agreement. It was easier to believe the outsider was simply reckless, but Hamish knew it was murder. A woman doesn't lie down on a freezing altar stone with her hands neatly folded unless someone else has placed them there. "I'll have to call headquarters," Hamish said, his voice dripping with genuine misery. The peace of Lockdow was shattered. DCI Blair will be down from Strathbane by lunchtime. A collective shudder went through the crowd. Blair was universally despised. Hamish stood by the grim altar, mourning his cold coffee and his undisturbed life. He had a dead bride, a set of mysterious tracks, a lingering scent of perfume, and an impending invasion by his screaming boss. It was shaping up to be a truly miserable Tuesday, and he had a feeling that the missing bride was hiding a secret that would make everyone's life, especially his own, much more complicated. Chapter 3. Blair's Bluster and the False Arrest. The peace of Lockdow was officially obliterated at precisely 11 o'clock by the ear-splitting wail of sirens. It was a completely unnecessary display. The crime scene was not going anywhere, and the victim was quite famously not going to get up and leave. But such was the way of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He arrived in a convoy of 2 black patrol cars, tires spinning on the mud of the narrow, unpaved lane leading to the standing stones, scattering a group of terrified sheep who had been minding their own business. Hamish Macbeth watched from the lee of a nearby dry stone wall, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Beside him, Lugs let out a low, mournful growl. Hamish mirrored the sentiment exactly. He saw the doors fly open and DCI Blair emerge, his face already flushed a deep, apoplectic purple. His uniform straining at the buttons, as if his own ego were physically inflating him. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, the sound echoing off the hillsides like a crack of thunder. "Where are you, you useless, loafing, miserable excuse for a constable?" Hamish stepped out from behind the wall, moving with the deliberate, agonizing slowness of a man who had all the time in the world. He tipped his cap, a gesture that managed to be respectful while simultaneously insulting. "Morning, Chief Inspector. Fine day for a drive, isn't it? Though the track's a bit boggy." Blair walked, his heavy boots crushing the wet grass. He stopped inches from Hamish's face, his eyes bulging. "Do not talk to me about the weather, you monumental waste of space. I am told there is a corpse draped over an ancient altar like some sort of theatrical display. An English bride. A woman of significant status. And you were the first on the scene." "I was," Hamish admitted, keeping his voice flat and monotone. "Found her a couple of hours ago. Seems to have laid down to rest, poor soul. The stones are cold enough to sap the warmth right out of you." Blair let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. He spun on his heel and strode toward the monoliths, his subordinates trailing behind him like anxious ducklings. He peered at the lifeless body of the bride, took one look at her elegant traveling suit, and instantly recoiled, holding a silk handkerchief to his nose. "Disgusting," Blair bellowed. "Look at this, Sergeant. An obvious case of domestic tragedy turned violent. Some local brute clearly took exception to her engagement and decided to finish things here. You're there." He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at a passing shepherd who had stopped to watch from the ridge. You look suspicious. You're under arrest." "Now, sir," Hamish interjected, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "That's Ian, our best wool clipper. He's been on the ridge all morning, and he's 80 if he's a day. I don't think he has the motive, nor the energy, to carry a woman to the altar stone." "Quiet, Macbeth!" Blair turned on him, his face darkening from purple to near black. "I don't need your half-witted observations. I am the lead investigator here. You have demonstrated, repeatedly, that your only skill is cultivating dampness in the police station. You are to stay out of the way. Do not speak to the witnesses. Do not touch the evidence. If I see you doing anything other than standing in a corner looking thick, I will personally see to it that you are demoted to a desk job in the most miserable substation in the Highlands." "Yes, sir," Hamish said, lowering his eyes to the ground. Inside, he was already calculating the time it would take for Blair to inevitably bungle this. Blair turned his attention back to the scene. He began barking orders with the authority of a man who had never actually solved a murder on his own. He insisted on having the entire area cordoned off with bright yellow police tape, although the only people around were the local sheep. He ordered his men to photograph the body from 20 different angles, insisted that the monoliths be examined for signs of ritualistic struggle, and spent a solid 10 minutes trying to identify the victim's missing hairpin as a key piece of occult evidence before being corrected by a younger, more sensible officer. Hamish watched with a heavy heart. He knew that Blair's focus on the obvious motive of a spurned lover was not just wrong, it was dangerously distracting. The DCI was so desperate to close the case quickly, to gain the praise of his superiors, that he was already building a narrative that fit his own prejudices. He wanted a local villain, a simple motive, and a quick confession. He didn't want the truth. As Blair continued to shout at the trembling villagers, Hamish began to drift away. He didn't walk fast. He simply shuffled, keeping his head down and his posture slumped. He moved toward the perimeter, his eyes darting across the ground. He looked for the subtle signs that Blair's men were systematically erasing. He leaned against a fence post, closing his eyes for a moment to center himself. He could still remember the scent of jasmine. It hadn't been a spurned lover. It had been someone who moved with purpose. Someone who had orchestrated this scene to look like a tragedy. He opened his eyes and looked back at the circus Blair had created. He knew the drill. To save the innocent, he would have to work in the shadows, move beneath the notice of the loud, raging man who considered himself his superior. He would have to start mooching for clues, and he would have to start doing it now, before the trail went completely cold. The murder of the bride was not just a tragedy. It was a puzzle. And for the first time in a long while, Hamish Macbeth found himself almost interested in solving it. "He's going to arrest the wrong man, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Lugs let out a soft, sympathetic bark. Hamish sighed, adjusted his cap, and prepared to start his real work. The game was afoot, and he was the only one who didn't want to play it. Chapter 4. Tea, Gossip, and Hidden Grudges. By mid-afternoon, the initial excitement of the discovery had settled into a sullen, watchful silence over Loch Dhu. DCI Blair, having successfully terrorized the local community to the point of near catatonia, had retreated to the village pub to organize his files and shout at his subordinates. This left the village streets mostly clear, which suited Hamish Macbeth perfectly. Hamish didn't investigate like a policeman. He didn't interview suspects in cold, stark rooms with bright lights, nor did he demand signed affidavits. He mooched. It was an art form he had perfected over years of living in a village that valued gossip over truth. His first stop was the post office. It was the central nervous system of the village, presided over by Mrs. Cruikshank, a woman who could deduce the state of a marriage by the frequency of postcard mailings. "Terrible business, Hamish," she said, before he had even opened his mouth. She was busy stamping letters with a rhythmic, aggressive thwack, thwack, thwack. "And that Blair man, shouting at poor Ian. It's a disgrace. If you ask me, he wouldn't know a murderer if one was standing right behind him wearing a name tag. He's a busy man, Mrs. Cruikshank," Hamish said, leaning against the counter and looking aimlessly at a display of postcards featuring Highland cows. "Big city thinking. Doesn't have the time for our local pace. Did the missing bride have much post? She was here for a day or two." Mrs. Cruikshank stopped stamping. Her eyes narrowed behind her spectacles. "Only one letter. Heavy cream envelope. Thick cardstock. Delivered by private courier 2 days ago. After the poor woman had checked into the inn. I've still got it here. She never came to collect it." She slid the envelope across the counter. It was addressed to the bride at the inn. The return address was a firm of solicitors in Edinburgh, a name Hamish recognized as one that handled complex, often sordid, inheritance disputes. He tucked the information away, noting the firm's name with a mental pin. "Did she have any visitors?" Hamish asked, sounding as if he were just making conversation. "Only the man," Mrs. Cruikshank said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The one who came yesterday, brother." They were arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but the way he was pointing his finger, disgraceful. And she had the look of a woman who was holding on to a very sharp secret, if you take my meaning. Any idea where she went after that? None at all. But she didn't come off the bus. She had a silver car waiting down the lane. Expensive, left a trail of that fancy jasmine perfume behind her. Hamish thanked her, grabbed a couple of free biscuits from a jar on the counter, and wandered back out into the cold. The scent. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was someone who had come here specifically to see her, and likely, to ensure she never reached the altar. His next stop was the curry shop, where he found the owner, Hari, scrubbing the floor with an intensity that suggested he was trying to erase the very memory of the tragedy. "Hamish," Hari sighed, leaning on his mop. "This is bad for business. Tourists don't like eating in a village where people are found dead in standing stones. Blair has been here twice today, demanding to know if I saw anyone suspicious lurking about." "And did you?" Hamish asked, opening a packet of tea he had borrowed from the station earlier. "Everyone is suspicious in a village like this, Hamish, you know that," Hari chuckled. "But no, I didn't see the killer. I did see the bride, though. She was sitting in the corner over there 2 nights ago. She was drinking jasmine tea and talking to someone on her cell phone. Very quiet, very intense. She kept saying, 'The inheritance is mine, and I don't care who gets hurt.' She seemed worried about someone, but she was more determined than anything." "Did she mention any names?" "She said something about the estate and the deadline, and she kept looking at her watch, like she was waiting for someone to arrive." Hamish nodded, his mind working through the threads. A solicitor's letter, a mysterious man in a silver car, an argument about inheritance, and a deadline. It was starting to look less like a random act of rural violence, and more like a calculated execution over money. He left the shop and headed toward the lock, needing a moment of silence to process. He sat on a cold stone bench, letting Lugs chase a seagull that was far too fast for him. The pieces were forming a picture, but it wasn't the picture Blair was painting. Blair wanted a simple, angry local villain. But reality was much more cynical. The bride wasn't just a happy, nervous visitor. She was an agent of disruption, a woman who had been threatening something, or someone, that had deep roots here. He thought about the brother in the silver car. He had been arrogant, cold, and composed. He hadn't looked like a man who would lose his temper in a public post office unless the stakes were incredibly high. Hamish looked across the water, the dark, mirrored surface of the loch holding its secrets tightly. He knew he was getting closer, but he also knew that for every step he took toward the truth, he had to take 2 steps back into his lazy persona to avoid Blair's radar. He was a puzzle wrapped in a thick wool sweater, a detective who didn't want to be caught detecting. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley, Hamish felt the familiar, low-level hum of the hunt. He had the motive, he had the scent of the perfume, and he had the knowledge that the village was holding its breath. He just needed to find the connection before Blair arrested someone innocent, and the real killer slipped away into the twilight. He stood up, shivered in the biting wind, and started the long, slow walk back to the station. There was still a lot of tea to be made, and many more questions to be asked, very, very quietly. Chapter 5. Priscilla's Perceptive Advice. The following morning, the atmosphere in Lochdoe felt suffocating. DCI Blair had spent the night in the pub, fueled by a mixture of cheap scotch and his own mounting paranoia, and was now back on the prowl. He had decided that if the local shepherd was too old for the job, it must be the shepherd's son, despite the boy having an ironclad alibi involving a broken tractor, a flooded field, and 3 witnesses. Hamish, having successfully avoided Blair by hiding in the back room of the bakery, decided it was time to seek counsel from the one person whose insight he truly valued, Priscilla Halberton Smythe. Priscilla was the daughter of the local grandee, and in Hamish's estimation, the most infuriatingly perceptive woman in the Highlands. Their relationship was a complex, tangled mess of unspoken feelings, social class divides, and mutual frustration. She was currently at the village hall, overseeing the preparations for the upcoming autumn fete, looking utterly composed despite the local crisis. "Hamish," she said, not looking up from a clipboard as he wandered in, trying to look as though he had simply lost his way. "I suppose you're here to avoid Blair. I heard him shouting at the butcher from 3 streets away." "He's a man of great enthusiasm," Hamish said, slouching against a stack of folding chairs. "I just need a moment of peace, and perhaps a bit of advice. You knew the bride who died, didn't you? She was poking around your father's estate yesterday." Priscilla paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. She was, yes. She was elegant, determined, and entirely convinced that everyone in this village was waiting to be bought. "My father was quite livid with her. But I imagine half the village was." "Did she mention anyone else? Any associates? A man, perhaps? Elegant, silver car, smelled of heavy cologne." Priscilla frowned, a flicker of genuine interest crossing her face. "A man? No, she didn't mention a man by name, but she did mention a meeting. She said she was meeting someone who understood the true value of the land." "I assumed she was talking about a rival developer." Hamish sighed, feeling a familiar ache in his chest. It seems this wasn't just about land. There's something more, something that made her desperate. "Hamish," Priscilla said, stepping closer, her voice lowering. "You're acting as if you're actually investigating, are you?" "I'm just observing," Hamish said, his voice dropping into its practiced, lazy drawl. "I don't like the look of things, Priscilla. Blair is going to ruin a perfectly innocent family, and the person who actually killed that bride will get away with it. I can't have that on my conscience. It's too much paperwork." Priscilla laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "You and your paperwork. You know, you are a far better detective than you let on. It's a pity you're so determined to hide it. If you actually tried, you might be a chief inspector yourself one day." "God forbid," Hamish shuddered. "I'd rather be a ghost." She leaned in, her eyes searching for him. "Listen to me, Hamish. That bride wasn't just a visitor. She was a collector of sorts. She bought properties that had hidden histories, old titles, abandoned rights, that sort of thing. If she was here, she wasn't just looking at the bridge. She was looking for something in the archives." "Did you check her room at the inn?" Hamish shook his head. "Blair has it sealed tight. Blair is a fool. He's looking for bloodstains, not paper. If you want to know who killed her, look for what she was trying to find." She gave him a look that was challenging and oddly affectionate. It was moments like these that made Hamish feel both incredibly capable and completely out of his depth. He understood the social dynamics of the village, the grudges, the secrets, the subtle power plays. But Priscilla understood the world beyond the village, the world the bride inhabited. "I have to go," Hamish said, feeling a sudden sense of urgency. And thank you, Priscilla. He struggled for a word that wasn't too revealing. Helpful. Don't get yourself arrested, Hamish, she called out as he turned to leave, and try to at least look like you're doing your job. He walked out of the hall, the cool air hitting his face. He had a new lead. The archives, the hidden history. He now realized that murder was not about the present, but the past. The bride had been digging up something someone wanted to stay buried. He did not return to the station. Instead, he started walking toward the local parish library, a dusty, forgotten building on the edge of the village. Had she been looking for something, she would have started there. As he walked, his mind raced. He had the motive, the method, and the mystery of the woman in the jasmine perfume. He felt the weight of the investigation pressing him. But beneath the anxiety, there was a spark of something else, the thrill of the puzzle. He reached the library, the old stone walls cold against the evening air. He knew the librarian, an ancient woman named Miss Murchison, would be there. If he could charm her, he might be able to access the archives before Blair even thought to check them. He adjusted his uniform, smoothed his hair, and put on his most vacant, friendly smile. He was Hamish Macbeth, the local, lazy, harmless policeman, and he was about to find the secret that had cost a woman her life. He merely hoped, as he pushed open the creaking library door, that he wasn't too late to stop the next disaster before it even started. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Dusty Library Archives. The parish library was a tomb of forgotten genealogies and damp-smelling municipal records. Miss Murchison, a woman whose skin had taken on the texture of the vellum she guarded, peered at Hamish over the top of her spectacles. She was, as always, deeply suspicious of anyone who showed an interest in history that didn't involve their own immediate relatives. "The police have already been here, Constable," she said, her voice like grinding stones. "That loud, red-faced man. He made me show him the birth records of every crofter within 10 miles. He seemed convinced that someone was born to be a murderer." "DCI Blair is very thorough," Hamish said, leaning against the checkout desk and trying to look like he was struggling with the complexity of a simple library card application. "I'm just here to double-check a few minor things for the report. You know how it is. The paperwork never ends." Miss Murchison huffed, clearly unimpressed, but she gestured toward the back shelves. "The archives are in the damp room. If you ruin anything, you'll be the one to pay for it." Hamish thanked her and drifted toward the stacks. Once out of sight, his posture straightened. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, his fingers skimming the spines of leather-bound ledgers. He wasn't looking for births or deaths. He was looking for property records. The dead bride had been obsessed with land rights. If she had been killed over a document, that document had to be here. He found it wedged behind a pile of 19th-century tax assessments, a land survey dated from the late 1920s. It wasn't the survey itself that was interesting, but the map attached to it. It highlighted a specific nondescript patch of moorland, the very patch the bride had been trying to purchase, and circled a long-abandoned structure marked simply as the oubliette. Hamish frowned. He pulled a notebook from his pocket and scribbled the reference. It wasn't a commercial development site at all. It was an old holding cell, a relic of the days when the local lairds held their own private justice. If the bride had found proof that the land rights to that structure were still technically held by a family line that had gone extinct, she could have claimed the land for pennies on the pound, effectively stripping the current occupants of their ancestral home. Suddenly, a heavy shadow fell across the aisle. Hamish didn't jump. He just slid the survey back into place with practiced ease and turned, his face reverting to a look of mild, sleepy confusion. It was Sergeant McLean, no relation to the crofter, one of Blair's lackeys. He was holding a file with a look of extreme self-importance. "Macbeth," he barked, "what are you doing back here? The chief inspector has officially declared the investigation a closed matter. He's about to make an arrest." Hamish blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs. An arrest? Already? But the evidence? "The evidence is all there, you fool. We found the missing hairpin." Hamish felt his stomach drop. "Where?" "In Henderson Croft's tack room, hidden under a pile of horse blankets. Blair says the boy, the crofter's son, must have panicked, killed the woman, and hid the pin, only to realize he couldn't get rid of it. We're heading over to pick him up now. The chief inspector is going to call the press. He's going to be a hero." Hamish felt a cold wave of realization. A hairpin hidden in the tack room. It was too neat, too perfect. The crofter's son was a simple lad. He wouldn't have known how to hide a pin, and he certainly wouldn't have been clever enough to leave it in his own barn. It was a plant. The killer had framed the most obvious suspect, and Blair, in his arrogance, had swallowed it whole. "I see," Hamish said, his voice quiet. He had to act. If Blair arrested the boy, the real killer would have the perfect cover. "Well, I suppose I should go and witness the arrest." "Stay here, Macbeth," the sergeant commanded. "Your incompetence is noted. You're off the case." As the sergeant marched out, Hamish felt a surge of cold, hard focus. The red herring was exactly that, a distraction intended for a man who wasn't looking for the truth. He knew now that the killer was watching this, waiting for the arrest to be made so they could slip away. He didn't wait. As soon as the librarian's back was turned, Hamish slipped out the side door, his mind racing. He had the location, the oubliette, and he had the realization that the murderer was someone with access to both the croft and the legal documents. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate Blair's ego. He wasn't going to the Henderson Croft to watch the arrest. He was going to the moor. He had a feeling that the extinct lineage wasn't as extinct as the records suggested. He just needed to find the evidence before Blair destroyed the last hope of justice in Lockdow. The game was no longer about mooching. It was about survival. He checked his pockets, made sure his torch was working, and set off into the gathering dark. The silence of the Highlands felt heavier than ever, pregnant with the weight of the coming confrontation. He knew the killer would be there, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. And this time, Hamish Macbeth wouldn't be playing the fool. Chapter 7. The Dark Truth of the Oubliette. The walk to the moor was a grueling trek through knee-deep heather and freezing, boggy ground that threatened to pull the boots off Hamish's feet with every step. The wind had picked up a mournful, howling thing that whipped his red hair into his eyes. But Hamish didn't slow his pace. He wasn't the slow-moving, lazy constable now. He was a man with a target, his movements fluid and purposeful as he navigated the treacherous terrain by the faint, silvery light of the moon. "The oubliette," he muttered, lugs shivering at his heels, "a perfect place to bury a secret." As he approached the desolate structure, a crumbling stone circle that had once been a prison, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The land didn't just contain a ruin. It contained a record. If the land rights had indeed reverted to an extinct line, that meant the current owner, the local estate manager who had been so helpful to Blair, had been lying through his teeth. He reached the perimeter of the ruins. The structure was little more than a mound of moss-covered granite, but in the center, hidden beneath a heavy slab of slate, was a dry, narrow opening that led down into the earth. Hamish pried the slab aside with a grunt of exertion, his muscles corded and taut. He clicked on his torch, the beam cutting through the damp darkness, to reveal a small subterranean room. It wasn't a dungeon anymore. It was an office. A desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet stood in the center, perfectly preserved in the cool, dry air, and there, sitting on the desk, was a ledger. Hamish descended the narrow stone steps, his heart hammering against his ribs. He opened the ledger, and the motive for the murder lay bare. It was a list of names, dates, and payments, a secret ledger of the estate's true ownership, showing that the land had not been extinct, but had been illegally seized and sold off in pieces by the estate manager to pay for his own debts. The dead woman had found it. She hadn't been buying the land for development. She had been blackmailing the man who had stolen it. "Jealousy and greed," Hamish whispered, his voice echoing in the small, cramped space. The oldest story in the Highlands. The killer wasn't a local crofter or a disgruntled sheep owner. It was the man who had been at Blair's elbow the entire time, whispering into the DCI's ear, feeding him the evidence he needed to frame the Henderson boy. He was the one who had worn the perfume, a rare, expensive jasmine scent he'd likely stolen from the woman's own luggage. And he was the one who had planted the hairpin in the barn. He heard a sound above him, a crunch of gravel. A shadow fell across the opening, blocking out the moonlight. "You always were too smart for your own good, Macbeth," a voice called down. It was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of the warmth the man usually projected. Hamish didn't look up. He stood calmly, closing the ledger with a soft, final thud. He felt the cold iron of a pistol barrel pointed down the hole. "You killed her because she wouldn't stop, didn't you?" Hamish asked, his voice steady. "She wasn't going to buy the land. She was going to turn you in. She was a parasite," the man said, his voice tightening. "She thought she could bleed me dry. I had a life here, a reputation. She was going to destroy it for a few miserable acres." "And the Henderson boy?" Hamish continued, his hand drifting toward his belt, where he kept his heavy, regulation-issue torch. "He was just convenient, a way to keep Blair off your scent." "Blair is a loud, blustering idiot," the man spat. "It was almost too easy. He wanted a villain so badly he didn't care who it was." Hamish stood in the darkness, the beam of his torch pointing away from the stairs, toward the back of the room. He needed to get out, but he had to be careful. The man above him was desperate, and a desperate man was more dangerous than a professional one. "You won't get away with it," Hamish said, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the shadows of the far wall. "The evidence is here, in this book. And I know about the silver car. I know about the jasmine perfume. You weren't as careful as you thought." "It doesn't matter," the man replied, his voice chillingly calm. "Because you're not going to leave this hole, Macbeth. Nobody knows you're here. The village thinks you're on a mental health leave after your failure at the bridge. They'll find your body in a few months, and they'll call it a tragic accident. A drunken fall. A lost soul in the hills." Hamish felt the cold sweat prickling his skin. He was trapped, and the man above him had all the advantages. But he also had something the killer didn't: local knowledge. A dog who was currently growling softly in the corner, and a lifetime of learning how to survive the Highlands. He looked at the narrow, stone-walled room. He saw a pile of loose, crumbling granite in the corner, the result of years of erosion. If he could trigger a collapse, he could create a distraction. A mess. Way to move. "You think you're the smartest one in the room, don't you?" Hamish asked, his voice low, a challenge. "I know I am," the man said. Hamish didn't wait. He grabbed a heavy piece of stone, braced himself, and threw it with all his strength, not at the man, but at the support beam holding up the ceiling of the oubliette. The wood groaned, splintered, and gave way. A cascade of dirt and stone began to pour down into the room, creating a wall of debris between Hamish and the opening. He didn't need to win the fight. He just needed to survive the night. He grabbed the ledger, tucked it into his jacket, and pulled lugs close. It was time to change plans. The trap was about to be sprung, and he was the one holding the string. Chapter 8. The Hunter Sets His Trap. The collapse of the oubliette ceiling provided Hamish with exactly the chaotic exit he needed. As the stones tumbled, and a suffocating plume of ancient dust filled the subterranean chamber, he didn't wait to see if the killer had been injured by the shifting debris. He threw himself into the narrow, dark tunnel that had once served as a drainage pipe for the prison. It was narrow, slick with slime, and smelled of centuries of decay. But it was an escape route. Lugs scrambled ahead of him, his claws clicking on the wet stone. Hamish emerged shivering into the freezing night air. Some 50 yards from the ruins, on the opposite side of a dense thicket of gorse. Behind him, he heard the frantic cursing of the estate manager. The man who, until moments ago, had seemed the epitome of local respectability. He was thrashing about in the ruin, firing his pistol into the darkness in blind, impotent rage. Hamish didn't run. He moved with a hunter's deliberate silence, circling back toward the perimeter of the moor. He had the ledger tucked firmly inside his tunic, held against his chest like a holy relic. This little book of secrets was the key, but it was also a death warrant. He needed to get it to a place where it couldn't be destroyed. And he needed to ensure that when the end game came, he held all the cards. He bypassed the main track, knowing the killer would head there, expecting Hamish to flee toward the village. Instead, Hamish cut through the dense, boggy heart of the woods, heading for the old crofter's cottage he used as a secret retreat. It was a place Blair never visited because it lacked electricity, and more importantly, a phone line. Once inside the drafty, stone-walled room, Hamish lit a single lantern, shielding it carefully, so no light escaped the heavy shutters. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the ledger open before him, the names, the offshore accounts, the forged deeds. It was all there in meticulous, damning detail. The killer had been incredibly organized, which was, ironically, his greatest weakness. Hamish began to construct his trap. He didn't need to be faster or stronger than the man. He just needed to be more deceptive. He pulled out a piece of thick parchment and a fountain pen. He began to write a note, mimicking the stiff, formal handwriting of a legal assistant. He addressed it to the local newspaper editor, detailing the discovery of the stolen land documents and indicating that a copy had been sent to the Strathbane police headquarters as an insurance policy. It was a complete lie. He hadn't sent anything yet, and he couldn't, given that the nearest post office was miles away and the roads were being patrolled by Blair's men. But the killer didn't know that. Hamish then set the stage. He left the fake copy of the ledger, a bundle of old, meaningless receipts tied with string, prominently on the table, surrounded by a mess of scattered papers to make it look like a hurried departure. He then grabbed his heavy wool coat, his lantern, and a length of sturdy, coarse rope. He didn't go back to the ruins. He went to the old, rusted iron bridge that spanned the ravine leading out of the valley, the only route back to town for anyone on foot. It was a place of high drama, narrow and precarious, perfect for a confrontation. He spent 20 minutes rigging a series of tripwires, using thin, transparent fishing line, attached to a collection of empty tin cans filled with stones. If anyone tried to cross the bridge in the dark, they would announce their arrival with a clatter loud enough to wake the dead. He then retreated to the shadows beneath the bridge's stone abutments, his back against the cold granite. He waited, his breathing slow and rhythmic, his senses tuned to the shifting wind and the distant, mournful hoot of an owl. He didn't have to wait long. An hour before dawn, a set of headlights cut through the darkness, moving slowly up the track toward the woods. The estate manager. The man was desperate now, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, jagged edge. He stopped his silver car, the same one Mrs. Cruikshank had noticed, at the edge of the bridge. Hamish watched as the man stepped out, his silhouette backlit by the car's headlights. He was holding a flashlight in one hand and a weapon in the other. He began to cross the bridge, walking cautiously, his eyes scanning the gloom. Click. The sound was sharp and metallic. The killer froze, the fishing line snagging his ankle. He looked down, panicked, and then, clatter, clatter, thud. The tin cans danced on the bridge deck, echoing through the ravine like a volley of gunfire. "Come out, Macbeth," the man shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I know you're here. You think you're clever, but you're just a country fool playing a dangerous game." Hamish didn't move. He kept his eyes on the man's shadow, waiting. The trap was set. The rumor of the leaked documents was planted in the killer's mind, and the bridge was now a stage. The man was walking into a vacuum of his own making, terrified by the very silence he had helped create. Hamish felt a strange, cold calm. The village was still. The wind had died down, and the final move was his to make. He adjusted his grip on the rope and prepared to step out of the shadows. The lazy constable was gone. There was only the man who would ensure that justice came to Lockdow, whether DCI Blair liked it or not. Chapter 9. Final confrontation on the bridge. The bridge shuddered as the estate manager stepped forward, his flashlight beam slicing wildly through the thick mist. He was breathing hard, the ragged, wet sound of a man whose nerves had been stripped raw by his own greed and the mounting pressure of the hunt. He crossed the center of the span, his boots ringing hollowly on the rusted iron plates. He was exposed, nervous, and utterly convinced that Hamish was lurking in the shadows just ahead, clutching the damning evidence of his crimes. "I know you have it," the man bellowed, his voice climbing an octave, hitting the high, brittle note of hysteria. "Give me the ledger, you idiot. You have no idea what you're meddling in. These are matters of property law, history. You're just a village constable who can't even hold on to his own tea mug. You think you're a hero? You're a footnote, Macbeth. A sad, pathetic little footnote that's about to be erased." Hamish didn't answer. He remained perfectly still, pressed against the damp, moss-covered granite of the bridge's foundation. He could see the man's feet, clad in expensive, mud-caked Chelsea boots, hesitating just inches from the primary tripwire. The man stopped, pointing his weapon toward the darkness, where he assumed Hamish was hiding. He was shaking, the barrel of the pistol tracing jagged arcs through the air. "Come out," the killer screamed again. "I'll kill you. I'll make sure they never even find enough of you to bury. I have connections, money, influence. Do you hear me? You are nothing." Hamish took a slow, steadying breath. He knew the man's arrogance was his anchor, but his fear was his engine. He waited until the man took one more aggressive step, a movement that placed his leading foot directly over the loop of coarse rope Hamish had hidden in the darkness. Hamish pulled. The rope whipped taut, snagging the man's ankle and sending him sprawling forward with a sudden, undignified violence. The man hit the bridge deck hard, his pistol skittering away and disappearing over the edge into the black, rushing waters of the ravine below. His flashlight flew from his hand, spinning across the iron plates before rolling to a stop, casting a stark, blinding beam directly into the man's terrified face. Hamish stepped out from the shadows. He didn't look lazy now. He didn't look like a man who spent his days avoiding work. His eyes were hard, focused, and utterly devoid of mercy. He was, as he had always been, the most dangerous man in the room, and he was finally done playing the fool. "You're right about one thing," Hamish said, his voice cold and cutting through the mountain air. "I am a village policeman, and in this village we don't take kindly to people who hurt our own." The killer scrambled backward, clawing at the rusted iron, his face a mask of primal panic. He tried to stand, but Hamish was already there, his movements quick and decisive. He lunged, pinning the man against the bridge railing. The iron groaned under the weight of them both, vibrating with the force of the struggle. The killer fought with the frantic, clawing strength of a cornered animal, swinging wildly. But Hamish was stronger, fueled by years of hard, quiet labor in the hills. He didn't hit the man. He simply pinned him, using his weight and the leverage of his position to lock the man's arms behind his back. "You're finished," Hamish gritted out, his face inches from the man's. "The ledger is safe. It's with people who know exactly how to read it. Your estate, your influence, your history, it's all gone. And by morning, DCI Blair will have a very clear picture of who actually killed that bride." "You can't," the man gasped, his body going limp under Hamish's iron grip. "Blair won't listen. He's already decided. He's going to arrest the Henderson boy. Blair will listen when I hand him the ledger," Hamish said, pulling a set of cold steel handcuffs from his belt. "He's a vain man, yes. He likes his medals and his praise, but he's not a murderer. When the evidence is overwhelming, he'll take the win, even if it means admitting he was looking at the wrong suspect all along. I'll let him take the credit. I'll let him bask in the glory, just so long as you are locked away where you can never hurt anyone in Lockdow again." The man went silent, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, defeated realization. He sagged against the railing, his eyes fixed on the darkness below the bridge. Hamish clicked the cuffs shut, the sharp, final sound echoing against the silence of the glen. He stood up, pulling the killer to his feet. The man was trembling now, a broken figure. Hamish grabbed his shoulder, turning him back toward the road where the silver car sat, its headlights still cutting a lonely path into the fog. "It's a long walk to the station," Hamish said, his voice returning to a neutral, conversational tone. "But I think you've got plenty of time to consider your life choices." He marched the man toward the vehicle, his grip firm and unyielding. The battle was over. The undercurrent of darkness that had threatened to consume the village had been drawn into the light. For the first time in days, the air felt clean. Hamish didn't feel like a hero. He felt exhausted, his muscles aching from the cold and the fight. He felt a deep, profound hunger for a hot cup of tea and a quiet chair. He reached the car, shoved the man into the passenger seat, and climbed into the driver's side. As he started the engine, he looked back at the bridge one last time. The peace of Lockdow had been broken, but it was mending. And tomorrow, he would have to deal with the aftermath, the questions, the shock, and the inevitable roaring fury of DCI Blair. But as he put the car in gear and turned away from the ravine, Hamish felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The village was safe, his secret was his own. And by this time tomorrow, he hoped to be back to his perfectly, wonderfully lazy routine. Chapter 10. Blair's Glory. Hamish's relief. The drive back to the village was punctuated only by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the tires against the frost-heaved road and the labored, shallow breathing of the man in the passenger seat. Hamish kept his hands loose on the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon for the first signs of dawn. He had the ledger tucked into the side pocket of the car, a silent, heavy witness to the night's events. He knew the moment he arrived at the station, the dynamics would shift. He had to be delicate. He had to be the fool again, or else the promotion he dreaded would become an immediate, terrifying reality. As they pulled into the outskirts of Lockdow, the village was waking up in shades of bruised purple and grey. The station was already a hub of activity. Blair's 2 patrol cars were parked haphazardly on the grass, and the DCI himself was standing on the steps, shouting into a radio with the kind of performative intensity that suggested he was doing it for an audience that wasn't there. Hamish pulled the silver car to a stop behind one of the police cruisers. He stepped out, his face carefully composed into an expression of profound, wide-eyed bewilderment. He opened the passenger door and gestured for the estate manager to emerge. Blair stopped mid-shout. He stared, his face turning that familiar, dangerous shade of purple as he took in the sight of the handcuffed man and the disheveled, mud-streaked constable. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, marching down the steps. "What is the meaning of this? You were ordered to remain off the case. And why are you driving the suspect's vehicle? Have you gone completely insane?" Hamish scratched his head, looking down at his boots as if he were trying to remember the alphabet. "Well, sir, it was a bit of a coincidence, really. I was out, walking the dog. Lugs needed a run, and I stumbled across this gentleman near the bridge. He seemed to be having a bit of trouble with his car, and I thought, well, he looked a bit suspicious, like someone who might have been involved in the business with the standing stones." Blair stopped inches from Hamish, his nostrils flared. "A coincidence? You were walking the dog. You are an absolute, terminal imbecile, Macbeth. You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. We have the Henderson boy in custody. We have the hairpin. This is a closed matter, and you have compromised it." "Yes, sir," Hamish said, his voice shrinking into a timid, apologetic mumble. But, see, I found this book in his car. I thought it looked like it might be important, though I can't read the legal bits myself, of course. It's all very complicated. He reached into the car and pulled out the ledger. He held it out to Blair, as if it were a heavy, dangerous object, his fingers trembling slightly. I'm sorry, sir. I'm sure it's nothing. Just some silly lists and numbers, but I thought you should have it, since you're the one in charge. Blair snatched the ledger, his lip curling in contempt. He flipped it open, intending to dismiss it as more of Hamish's rural nonsense. But as his eyes scanned the first page, the dates, the names, the clear, undeniable records of the illicit land sales and the payments linked to the estate manager, his expression transformed. The arrogance flickered, replaced by a sudden, sharp, predatory gleam. He realized exactly what he was holding. He realized that this wasn't just a list. It was the front page of every newspaper in Scotland. Blair looked up at Hamish, then at the estate manager, and finally back at the ledger. He didn't thank Hamish. He didn't acknowledge the nights of work, the cold, the danger, or the cleverness required to secure the evidence. Instead, he straightened his uniform, puffed out his chest, and looked at his subordinates. "Sergeant," Blair bellowed, his voice booming across the quiet village street. "Change of plans. We have been misled by a local fabrication of evidence, clearly a plant by the real perpetrator. Secure this man immediately. I have just uncovered the true motive and the missing link in the investigation. It appears we have been dealing with a far more complex web of corruption than we initially anticipated." He turned to Hamish, his eyes narrowing. "You, Macbeth, you will go inside and write a report. Keep it brief. Leave out your personal theories, and ensure that you acknowledge my direct oversight in this breakthrough. If I see a single word about your dog walking, I will have you scrubbing the floors of the station for the next 6 months. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Hamish said, his voice perfectly hollow. "I'll write it exactly as you say, sir. Get out of my sight." Hamish tipped his cap, turned, and walked toward the station, his back hunched, his shoulders sagging with every step. He didn't look back as Blair began to bark orders, already crafting the narrative of his own genius. He could hear the DCI spinning the story, taking the credit, and ensuring that no one would ever suspect the lazy constable had been the one to solve the murder. Inside the station, Hamish sank into his chair. He was exhausted, his joints ached, and his uniform was caked in mud. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd left on the stove. It was stone cold and bitter, but he drank it anyway. He had done it. He had caught the killer, saved the innocent boy, and kept his life exactly as he wanted it. No promotion, no transfer, no city life. Just the cold coffee, the quiet village, and the knowledge that justice had been served, even if the wrong man got the headline. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and allowed himself the luxury of a long, deep, and utterly deserved sleep. Chapter 11. Epilogue. A quiet return to Lockdow. The days following the arrest of the estate manager were a blur of frenetic, high-decibel activity that seemed to oscillate around the village like a localized storm. DCI Blair, having successfully positioned himself as the brilliant, tireless investigator who had cracked the case wide open, spent his time posing for photos with the local press and giving grand, sweeping interviews about his methodical approach to uncovering complex criminal networks. He had, as expected, taken full credit for the recovery of the ledger, painting it as the result of a strenuous, deep-cover operation that he had personally spearheaded. Hamish Macbeth, meanwhile, had receded into the background, becoming once again the invisible, sleepy-eyed constable who seemed to have spent the entire week napping in his office, while the real police did the work. By the weekend, the storm had passed. The news vans departed, the flashing lights disappeared, and the quiet, heavy blanket of the Highlands returned to Lockdow. The village seemed to inhale, a deep, collective breath that signaled the end of the disruption. The Henderson family, cleared of all suspicion, returned to their croft. The villagers went back to their grumbling about the weather, the price of tea, and the general state of the world, having successfully reclaimed their isolation. Hamish sat at the weathered kitchen table in his small house on the edge of the village. It was a clear, crisp evening, the kind where the stars seemed to hang low and bright over the jagged silhouettes of the mountains. He had a fire crackling in the hearth, the heat chasing away the lingering damp of the moors, and on the stove, a large iron pot bubbled with a rich, fragrant stew. It was a simple meal, but it was his, and tonight it tasted like absolute luxury. Lugs were stretched out on the rug, snoring with a contented, rhythmic sound that Hamish found immensely comforting. The dog had endured the stress of the chase with surprising grace, and now, he seemed perfectly happy to return to the life of a housebound, lazy pet. Hamish reached down to scratch the dog's ears, his mind wandering over the events of the past few days. He thought about the bride, the woman whose arrival had disrupted the very fabric of his world, and the estate manager, whose greed had blinded him to the reality of the small, tight-knit community he had tried to exploit. It was a grim business, murder, but it was over. The village was safe, and for Hamish, that was the only metric of success that mattered. There was a soft, tentative knock at the door. Hamish frowned, wondering who would be out at this hour, but he stood up, smoothing his disheveled hair. He opened the door to find Priscilla Smythe standing on the step, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. "I heard the village was finally quiet again," she said, her voice soft, with a hint of that familiar, sharp amusement. "I thought you might appreciate the company of someone who doesn't want to talk about Blair's latest press conference." Hamish stood aside, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. "You're always welcome, Priscilla. The stew is just about ready. It's not much, but it's warm. It smells divine," she said, stepping inside. She looked around the modest room, her eyes lingering on the stack of old, worn books on the table and the simple, functional furniture. There was a moment of silence between them, not the awkward, heavy kind, but the comfortable, resonant silence that had developed between them over years of shared secrets and unspoken understandings. They sat together as the evening deepened, talking about everything and nothing: the upcoming winter preparations, the state of the local gardens, the absurdity of the recent news cycle. Hamish didn't mention the ledger, and Priscilla didn't ask. They both knew the truth of what had happened, and that was enough. As he watched her, Hamish felt a strange, quiet contentment. He had sacrificed his reputation for laziness to keep his life the way he wanted it. And yet, in the quiet spaces between their conversation, he realized that he wouldn't trade his small, hidden world for any amount of professional acclaim. He liked being the man who knew things, the man who guarded the peace from the shadows, and he liked that Priscilla was the only one who truly saw the man behind the mask. When she finally left, disappearing into the dark, cold night, Hamish locked the door and returned to his chair by the fire. He poured a final, small glass of whiskey, savoring the warmth as it spread through his chest. He looked around his home, the humble, sturdy place that was his sanctuary. Outside, the wind howled around the chimney, a lonely, wild sound that usually brought a sense of isolation. But tonight, it just sounded like home. He stayed in Lockdow. He had avoided the move to the city, the demands of a higher rank, and the crushing weight of bureaucratic expectation. He had solved the mystery, protected the innocent, and managed to stay exactly where he belonged. As he listened to the fire crackle and felt the steady, peaceful rhythm of the house, Hamish let out a long, slow sigh of relief. The case was closed, the village was safe, and tomorrow was just another day of doing absolutely nothing of note, which was, quite possibly, the greatest victory of all. He was Hamish Macbeth, the laziest, smartest, and most content policeman in the entire Highlands, and for once, there was nowhere else on earth he would rather be. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire pulling him into a deep, peaceful sleep, ready for the quiet, lazy days ahead.